Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for having me this evening. Thank you so much for tuning in this evening, and thank you again, Luke, for the introduction. It's always fantastic. I always love coming to do a Western Front Association event. I've done many kind of local events, conferences, and had an association with the association, over a number of years, which it's always a real pleasure to be able to come and speak to kind of like-minded individuals and groups of people who are interested in hopefully interested in what I have to say this evening. And I think perhaps the subject area is perhaps a little bit kind of different in a lot of ways. I'm as you can see from the first slide, I work at the National Archives. I'm primarily responsible for our military records at TNA, and a lot of the work that I do, particularly if it's First World War related, is naturally related to the war itself. But obviously, this kind of strays a little bit away from that into that post-war period. And this was a piece of work that I carried out a number of years ago, 4 or 5 years ago now, and really has acted as a bit of a catalyst for me to kind of explore other areas in this kind of post 1918 period of uncertainty for the British Army. Again, off the back of some of this work, worked on looking at things like the British Army's involvement in Upper Silesia in Poland in the immediate post First World War period, and also more generally kind of looking at I suppose the rebuilding of the British Army in that post-war period. But what I'm, as I say, gonna talk to you a little bit about this evening, this idea and the quotation here: "The British soldier is no Bolshevik," which I'll come back to towards the end of the talk directly. But it's certainly a theme that hopefully kind of comes through when I'm talking this evening. And I'm kind of looking at this subject from in a number of different ways, and I'd come across these strikes in 1919, mutinies perhaps in some people's eyes, when I was doing work in the southeast of England, in Kent, during the centenary period. I did a lot of work in Folkestone and Dover, and that's when I first came across these acts of indiscipline, if you like. And again, I'll talk certainly about Folkestone in a bit more detail shortly. It was not really an event, or indeed number of events, that I was particularly familiar with, but I very quickly built a kind of picture that then I think kind of touched upon a number of really interesting and important themes, many of which hopefully I'll also touch upon this evening, particularly the idea of discipline in the armed forces, both during the First World War and indeed more generally, but also ideas of patriotism, self-sacrifice, kind of these kind of rather, in some ways, I suppose, abstract themes around why soldiers endured, why soldiers fought during the First World War, but then also feeding and how things like these kinds of activities, these kinds of acts of disobedience, fed into a wider conversation, wider issues in that immediate post-Armistice period, I suppose, after November 1918. How the actions which are kind of occur in early 1919 right up until the middle of 1919 fit into a kind of broader context of uncertainty, of unrest, and of fear, particularly from the authorities. And there, as I say, some of the things that I'll hopefully touch upon in some way today, and hopefully in an interesting and of course enlightening way. So just to kind of start things off, I was recently reading the memoir of the author and playwright J.B. Priestley, who writes at length actually about his First World War service, both in the other ranks. He joined the army in the first week of September 1914 and was eventually promoted from the ranks. And in his memoir, he also includes, again, amongst many other things, a description of the scenes which he witnessed once men had begun to, shall we say, get twitchy about their delayed demobilization after the end of the war. He explained that one evening he was ordered to report to the train station in Lille in early 1919, where he was told to his astonishment that he was the only officer due to travel on the train to Boulogne, a train filled with men due for demobilization. And this is a quote from his memoir. I was to be responsible for all men on it, hundreds and hundreds of them, embittered and sober, roaring and drunk. Discipline, always harder to maintain when men were away from their units and came from every branch of the service, had worn so thin you could hear it cracking. It was almost like an army disintegrating into revolution. Now, again, this evening, I certainly won't be going as far as to suggest that the army was on the brink of revolution in 1919. Overall, soldiers did toe the line, as they had done for much of the war, but the system in particular of demobilization and the consequences of its perceived unjust nature placed the continued good discipline of the British Army in doubt for much of that year, for much of 1919. And again, what I'd like to argue, and hopefully that will be clear as we go through the talk this evening, is that very few soldiers had any real political motivations in their actions. Their service and therefore their discipline during the war was conditional and could not really last that far beyond the end of hostilities. Citizen soldiers, as most of them were, both volunteers and conscripts alike, had been, I suppose, kind of inculcated with a belief that their discipline came from their patriotism and especially their self-sacrifice. And in this context, it's hardly surprising that once the enemy was defeated in November 1918, this notion of self-sacrifice was no longer relevant. And like I say, these are some of the things that I hope I'll explore, and it'll be clear that I'll be exploring them in a bit of detail as we go through this evening. So, moment of truth that the slide's moving. Hopefully that has. I appreciate this slide has an enormous amount of text. But this quotation, which I'll read in full in a moment, I think is always worth a look. So I'm going to take us back a little, take us back to 1917 briefly. So in a memorandum to the War Cabinet in October 1917, over a year before the Armistice, Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig, wrote the following, quote, "Immediately hostilities cease, we must be prepared for a general relaxation of the bonds of discipline. Men's minds, energies, and thoughts will no longer be occupied by the task of defeating and destroying the enemy, but will trend naturally towards early return home. Hence, as soon as demobilization commences, a feeling of jealousy will arise. Men will keenly watch the departures of others and will institute comparisons as to their respective claims. There will be generally an unsettled state, and as a natural consequence of a prolonged and arduous war, nerves will be in an irritable and unstable condition. We have, therefore, to realize that the temper of the troops during this period will be a factor not to be lightly disregarded." And Haig had written this statement in response to what at the time were the draft plans for military demobilization, which specified that men would leave the army based on their occupation, and that occupation and their need for demobilization was assessed on the economic needs of the country and not to be judged by an individual's length of service. And that's crucial, crucial point to kind of remember here. So while stating that he understood, Haig that is, that he understood these requirements, he believed that the disciplinary side of demobilization had not been given sufficient attention. In a rebuttal letter, though, he was told that the economy must take precedence, and that, quote, powerful aid to the maintenance of discipline in France will be afforded by the knowledge that any act of indiscipline will, in accordance with the regulations, which have been drafted to carry out the scheme of demobilization, entail delay in the man's return to this country. Now, after what were, to say the least, the turbulent few months of strikes and collective disobedience in the armed forces following the cessation of hostilities, this memorandum resurfaced and was presented once more to the cabinet in February 1919 by Winston Churchill, who by that point was the newly appointed Secretary of State for War. As a supplement to it, Churchill stated that, quote, it will be seen that he, Haig, forecasted accurately the state of indiscipline and disorganization which would arise in the army if favoritism were to rule in regard to the discharge of men. Additionally, that it was, quote, surprising that the commander-in-chief's prescient warnings were utterly ignored and the army left to be irritated and almost convulsed by a complicated artificial system open at every point to suspicion of jobbery and humbug. I think kind of looking at these things, there's no doubting Haig's knowledge of the army under his command and indeed the risk that demobilization had on the prospect of a breakdown in discipline. And it's, as I say, this indiscipline and the strikes which resulted from it that I'm going to talk a bit more about in a moment. To show this, and again, mainly for kind of limitations of time, I could go on for hours, but I won't. I'm going to be giving a kind of a few examples and a taster of some of this indiscipline and kind of how it affected how the authorities dealt with soldiers who carried out these acts. Now, as I said, a lot of this is contextually important. Things like the Russian Revolution in 1917, in particular, is of kind of paramount importance when thinking about especially how the authorities, I suppose, react to these acts of disobedience. So, and again, this applies from, as I say, from 1917 onwards, and throughout 1917 and 1918, though reaching the point of mutiny at Etaples, unrest was relatively minor in the armed forces. That doesn't mean, though, that fear of unrest didn't exist, especially, again, within the context of the Russian Revolution. Concerns about the fragile nature of discipline and the potential Bolshevist influence on soldiers, and that's Bolshevist influence on soldiers, had surfaced when soldiers and workers' councils had been formed in 1917. In July of that year, Lord Derby had stated to the War Cabinet that, quote, in view of the fact that the army of today is by no means as highly disciplined as that in existence before the war, and also that the classes of men serving at the present moment include individuals of every shade of education and opinion, it is probable that the movement to encourage soldiers to take part in political questions will be fanned by certain political factions for their own ends. And the historian Chris Wrigley has suggested that it's no surprise that leading members of the government expressed concern about the spread of Bolshevism in Britain, and also that the potential for unrest in the armed forces only accentuated these fears. Though, in hindsight at least, unfounded, these fears certainly informed decision-making and were exacerbated by the concerted effort by elements of the labour movement to enlist support from the armed forces once strikes had broken out. And that's into 1919, I should say. And for an establishment suspicious of trade unionism, this must have been an alarming development. And as we shall see as well, the printed press, especially newspapers like the Daily Mail and also the Daily Herald, did little to help in these matters. Overall, soldiers and institutions such as the press towed the line, as they had done for much of the war. But the system of demobilization, and I come back to that, and the consequences of its perceived unjust nature, placed the continued good discipline of the British Army in doubt for much of 1919. So, as might be expected, we think about the plans for demobilization. These have been underway, the plans, since 1916. And so it's not really as if the authorities were caught unprepared when the armistice was signed on the 11th of November 1918. Yeah, and the scheme, I should say, the scheme of demobilization, again, as you might expect, was really an incredibly complicated administrative system. A nightmare, actually. There were 14 separate departments involved in the kind of implementation and the administration of demobilization. So an incredibly complicated system to try and implement. Many soldiers were caught by surprise, though. So again, in contrast to kind of thinking about these schemes, once we approached the 11th of November, as again, I'm sure many of you know, many soldiers were caught by surprise at the kind of sudden nature of the signing of the armistice. And really, in contrast to the scenes at home, reactions on the front lines, or indeed on the Western Front in particular, shall we say, were rather muted. Charles Carrington recalled that, quote, "victory was sudden and complete, and the general sensation was that of awaking from a nightmare." Percy Crozier stated that though men and women all over the world, quote unquote, went mad, the fighting men fresh from the line thanked God for delivery. George Jameson even went as far as to say that once the initial shock had subsided, he had the feeling of having been sacked and kicked out of the job, quote, like being made redundant. Others recalled awe, great relief, bewilderment, and indeed shock at the speed of the German collapse. Rapid demobilization quickly became a rallying cry during the general election campaign in December of 1918. Newspapers made really the business of demobilization theirs. The Daily Mail, labeling itself for much of the war as the soldier's paper, ran a column entitled Dilly Dally, which gave exhaustive examples of demobilization delays. And here's an example from the 5th of December 1918. The authorities had devised a priority system which was driven by the needs of the peacetime economy, as I previously mentioned. So the first soldiers set to be released would be demobilizers. That was the official term. So these were individuals who performed tasks in civilian life, which would speed up the demobilization of others. This would then be followed by so-called pivotal men who could provide employment for others, again, in turn, so as to speed up demobilization for others as well. And thirdly, there were so-called slip men, labeled as such because of the slips of paper that authorized their demobilization. And they could essentially, these were individuals who could provide proof that they had a job waiting for them upon their return to civilian life. And after these three groups, then a general demobilization could occur. And this was in stark contrast then, this kind of scheme was very different to basically any other demobilization scheme from the other major powers, particularly France and the United States, who essentially operate a first in, first out policy. And it was this third category, the so-called slip men, that was to provide the catalyst for some of the initial unrest in early 1919, because essentially these slip men were often those who had entered the army later in the war. Let's come back to this one. So the first major trouble occurs then in Folkestone on the 3rd of January 1919. According to some reports, upwards of 10,000 men refused to attend parade, having held a meeting the previous day, and declined to embark on boats bound for France. Excuse me. Instead, the large body of men marched to the town hall, and that's what the picture is here of Folkestone Town Hall, to pay a visit to the mayor of Folkestone. Here, speeches of, quote, of a moderate tone were made, claiming that many applications for demobilization were being ignored, despite men having jobs waiting for them. By that evening, the situation had been resolved when military officials, with the approval of the War Office, decided that rather than proceed with disciplinary measures against the men, time should be given for individuals to kind of make explanations as to their claims. So the men were dealt with on an individual basis. Those with contracts for work were demobilized immediately. Those with contracts which were not yet fully in order were permitted then an additional week's leave to attend to the necessary paperwork. And those with no prospects of contracts would return to duty at once. Lord Milner, as Secretary of State for War at this point, wrote to David Lloyd George stating that these concessions were, quote, the best way out of a bad business. It seemed then as if the disturbances were over as quickly as they had begun. But this leniency and sort of the way in which the authorities dealt with this unrest, this strike, if you like, would come back to haunt the authorities, and very quickly. Within 24 hours, other strikes had swept across the country, beginning just down the road in Dover. Army Service Corps men stationed in Osterley Park drove to Whitehall to put their case to the Prime Minister directly. One participant told a reporter that, quote, we have been informed that our branch of the service would be the last to be demobilized. Most of us have had over 2 years in France and have been wounded. In the following week, the demonstration, in the week following the demonstration at Folkestone, and using, again, the historian and journalist Andrew Rothstein wrote a really interesting short book about these soldier strikes in the late 70s, early 80s, and what is a really kind of thorough account of the individual strikes which occur across Great Britain. I think a very conservative estimate puts the number of soldiers striking as a result of demobilization delays at about 52,000, so approximately 1.5% of men under arms. While only a very small fraction of that total, it's unsurprising really that the authorities were concerned. When men of the Army Service Corps descended on Whitehall from camps on the outskirts of London, the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Sir Henry Wilson, wrote to Lord Derby stating that, quote, the heart of the present troubles in the army lies in the reckless speeches and promises made during the recent elections, and in constant civilian and therefore ignorant and dangerous interference in our demobilization scheme. Exactly where we are drifting to, for we are drifting, I don't know. At the present moment, there are rows of lorries outside this office, and 1,000 lorrymen up from Kempton with demands of sorts. One thing is certain, that unless the Prime Minister buckles to and makes it clear that he and the government are solid behind the War Office and the officers of the army, we shall lose the army, and then the navy, and then the air force. And I think what might become clear in a moment is, largely the ignorant civilians to which Wilson refers here were undoubtedly elements of the printed press. So when reporting the first strikes on the 3rd of January 1919, the Daily Mail, under the heading "Brainless Demobilization," stated that Sir Eric Geddes had, quote, so far successfully evaded the rope and lampposts that are said to await the politician who fails in his task, and that the red tabs were responsible for the, quote, blundering at Folkestone and elsewhere. Furthermore, that, quote, the lack of brains and a foresight displayed by the War Office is interfering with the restoration of national trade and prosperity, and that owing to the abundant respect which officers have for one another and their capacity for taking as long as possible to do nothing, we doubt whether even Folkestone will prove to be a sufficient awakening to them. Pretty strong stuff. But some of this criticism, and as I say, especially the newspaper press, and particularly relating to the general election in December 1918 and then early January 1919, is incredibly vocal. All of a sudden, is incredibly vocal about the slow nature of demobilization. They're publishing articles every single day. The Daily Express has a daily column essentially of individual soldiers expressing their kind of grievance at not being demobilized as well. And as I say, I think some of the criticism is unjust, and particularly if you look at the official figures for demobilization, that even by the end of 1918, over 330,000 officers and men had already been demobilized, and an additional over 71,000 had left the armed forces by the end of the first week of January, while nearly double that rate, 132,000, had left by the 16th of January. This represented at this point around 5.2% of officers and 12.6% of other ranks who had been serving on the 11th of November, which, as I say, within 2 months is not a bad rate in my view. And as I say, even before the unrest, these are pretty impressive figures. The fact that a higher rate of other ranks have been demobilized, leaving a disproportionate number of officers in service, is interesting, and I think further demonstrates the kind of complex nature of discipline and officer-man relations. We often talk about things like officer-man relations in the trenches and that kind of area of discipline, and the fact that a larger proportion of other ranks have been demobilized in comparison to officers, I think, is interesting and kind of shows a layer of complexity. Essentially, if we're to make the valid assertion that discipline largely was maintained for much of the war because of good officer-man relations, then how could it be that a higher proportion of officers could translate to poor discipline after the war? And this is where the kind of, one of the kind of broader points that I wanted to make comes in is, one way that you might explain it is to take Churchill's declaration that many of the most reliable non-commissioned officers had been prematurely demobilized, leading to a breakdown of discipline at a local level. And again, I think this certainly has some validity, but only tells half the story. I think also it's possible to point to the fact that, again, there's a soldier's sense of patriotism and self-sacrifice, which had been so prevalent in government propaganda throughout the war, had been so prevalent in the mindset of individuals, both, again, volunteers and conscripts, in terms of how they approach their military service throughout the war, that, essentially these notions, these two crucial elements, patriotism and self-sacrifice, were no longer applicable in this immediate post-war environment. So, I'll kind of move on to a section here which I've entitled Damage Control, which again perhaps will become clear in a moment. So, essentially, what do both the military and the political authorities do in this period after the first week or two in January, when things are starting to clearly get out of hand? There are, particularly in Britain, where the flow of information is a little freer than it is even in France and Belgium. In comparison to France and Belgium, things are spiraling, and things have spiraled very quickly. So what do the authorities do? So immediately after the wave of strikes, military censors put a stop to most reporting of these disturbances across the country. You look at newspapers, for this period. In this immediate period, again, they've been full of lots of information about strikes. They've been full of information about demobilization delays. Almost overnight, this stops. Individual accounts are just no longer reported. And again, this clearly influenced the stance, particularly of the Daily Mail. Probably the most widely read newspaper in the army at the time. So the day after what was a rather vitriolic article about demobilization, a more moderate article commented under the headline "Steady" that, quote, "aroused at last by the protests of the newspapers and the public, the authorities are taking action to remedy the delays and individual injustices of demobilization. They have met with good-humored demonstrations of soldiers tactfully and in the right spirit. The men will gain nothing further by organized unrest. Their common sense will tell them that any indiscipline will only prejudice the efforts to improve and speed up the machinery." And as I say, it's incredibly striking, that immediate overnight change in the tone of the way in which demobilization is being reported. I say, while not condemning the men for striking, the tone was clearly one of conciliation, urging men essentially to respect authority and their authorities. But for the say left-leaning, Sir George Lansbury-owned Herald newspaper, would become the Daily Herald shortly after January 1919, the tone continued to be much more belligerent. The strikes were in fact what its front page described as the Great Mutiny. And this is a quote from the article: "It was sheer, flat, brazen, open and successful mutiny. They, as in the soldiers, knew it, and they did it." For the newspaper's special correspondent, apparently in Folkestone, this was born because of incomprehensible forms and red tape. Trade unionists, according to the newspaper, had been elected as officials for a new soldiers' union, and a point stressed by the newspaper. Now was not the time for conciliation, it was time for action. During the following week, the paper noted how, quote, "a great silence had descended upon what it referred to as the capitalist press." Rather insightfully, articles stated that the troubles had come from the government and that the government press had only themselves to thank. A month previous, they had been, quote, "vociferously denouncing dilly and dally." The Prime Minister was promising that things should be speeded up, and that now they were solemnly lecturing the troops on the virtues of keeping steady. Despite claims made by the Herald, feelings of jealousy and frustration do appear to have existed. In his memoir, John Jackson stated, between former soldiers, I mean, John Jackson stated that the thought of so many old companions, quote, "gradually dwindling away from the regiment, made the remainder of us feel restless." George Ashurst claimed that the vast majority of soldiers got the army out of their minds and simply wished to leave. The thought of staying was not favourable. Roland Fielding wrote to his wife in early February that, quote, "the raging desire still continues to be demobilized quickly. Nevertheless, I feel pretty sure that for many, there will be pathetic disillusionment." Even as early as December 1918, William Andrews wrote that it was, quote, "a great grievance with us that munitions workers were at once free to get what jobs were now going, whilst we were kept in the army." Furthermore, that, quote, "one feels a little suspicious of the army authorities. They seem in no hurry to give up their power over the millions of soldiers who have not the slightest intention of serving again once they get out of khaki." He concluded that, quote, "thousands of officers have had the time of their lives and are sorry it is nearing an end." Ministers then also start to express their dismay at the attitude of the press in terms not dissimilar, actually, to those in the Herald. Winston Churchill, having taken over as Secretary of State for War on 10th of January 1919, presented a memorandum to the War Cabinet 4 days later. In it, he indicated that the press had been allowed to, quote, "run wild on the subject of demobilization, and that statements had been made with no foundation in fact. He believed that, quote, an influential part of the press, notably the Daily Mail, Daily Express, and other cheap newspapers which circulate widely in the army, had published articles abusing the military authorities and had specifically undermined discipline as a result. Clearly, now that the armistice had been signed, the press was no longer really playing fiddle, if you liked, playing the fiddle of Lloyd George and his government, as they had for most of the war. The press barons, Lord Beaverbrook and Lord Northcliffe, who had essentially directed propaganda for much of the war, would have to come back into line and support the government until a new plan could be devised. Within days of his cabinet memorandum, Churchill presented a new scheme, one which he had devised with the help of Henry Wilson and Haig. On the 17th of December, the decision was made. All men who had enlisted in 1914 and 1915 would be demobilized as soon as transport was available to bring them home, a total of 2.2 million men. Furthermore, all men who had joined the army after the 1st of January 1916 would be retained as part of the armies of occupation. In explaining the new scheme to Lloyd George, who was in Paris, Churchill stated that, quote, under the existing scheme, the discipline of the whole army is being rotted. I'm very anxious about the state of the army, both in France and at home. He believed that statements made by Lloyd George had done much to calm the situation in the kind of second and third week of January, and that the newspapers had, quote, seen the red light and have been trying to help as much as possible instead of exciting discontent. Both Lloyd George and Andrew Bonar Law initially rejected the scheme, especially because so many men would still be retained, and also that conscription would continue and would remain in place, a thorny issue and one which would need work in order to convince the public of its necessity. Churchill, and indeed Wilson and Haig, all travelled to Paris on the 23rd of January and finally managed to persuade. But the next hurdle was, of course, to convince the public that this was the correct course of action as well. And really, the best way to achieve and indeed achieve the aim and to kind of carry out the scheme successfully was to obtain the support of the press. On the same day that the scheme was presented to the cabinet, under a pledge of secrecy, Churchill sent full details of it to Lord Northcliffe. In explaining it, he stated that he did not fear the course of such a policy, quote, provided that a strong lead is given and that the reasons which make each step necessary are fully and frankly explained. Upon receiving these details, Northcliffe instructed his editors to publicize and to support the scheme, stating that, quote, all my newspapers will do exactly what you wish on the subject. Churchill also met with other correspondents in the last days of January. After that meeting, he wrote to Lloyd George on the 29th of January, quote, the newspaper men took it all like lambs. And the new scheme was indeed launched on the 30th of January, and true to the word of Northcliffe, the Daily Mail wholeheartedly supported it, stating, quote, nothing has been more honourable to our soldiers than the way in which they have received the new scheme, and the evidence of patience and patriotism which they are giving after their magnificent conduct on the battlefield. Moreover, that the new priority scheme, based on length of service, quote, satisfies the soldiers' instinctive respect for fairness. If the soldiers were happy with the new scheme, then how indeed could the public complain? However, notwithstanding this new scheme, on Monday the 27th of January, a major incident occurred at Calais involving the Army Service Corps and also individuals in particular from the Army Ordnance Corps. These men organised a strike, complaining about their long working hours and the poor conditions in the camps. This has merged also with then the frustrations over the slow pace of demobilization. A seditious speech, so called, was made by a private who was arrested. And from then on, essentially things spiral out of control, and again, very quickly. The men went out on parade, and when the sergeant major gave the order to move, not a single soldier did, as there were rumors that the arrested private had been shot. These rumors were unfounded, and indeed the soldier was also requisitioned by the striking men who, despite numerous discussions with high-ranking officers, did not waver in their position. And the location of the disturbance is significant here as well, because essentially thousands of men passed through these camps in and around Calais en route to and from the front during the period of war, but also kind of to and from the armies of occupation after periods of leave to and from Britain. And essentially then these men were thus brought face to face with the demands of the strikers. Again, there's a flow of information that is happening as a result. Many passing through soon, many individuals soon joined them, and also attempted even to commandeer boats back to England. The men elected a committee headed mainly by trade unionists and continued their collective disobedience. Haig, who by this point was rather anxious that things didn't get any further out of control, directed General Byng, who was the commander at Calais, to quell the disturbances at all costs if they spread to the town itself. Quote, discipline must be maintained, and rioters, if they cannot be arrested, must be shot. Those men who have returned from leave have no ground for complaint and appear to have been led astray by Bolshevik agitators. Eventually, on the morning of the 30th of January, men from the 105th Brigade, 35th Division entered the camp and surrounded the tents and huts. The men were told that those who wished to break off the strike could do so, and there would be no repercussions. The four-man committee then addressed the men and urged them to continue their efforts and their strike, but were largely ignored. The committee, the four individuals, were arrested as they then continued to try to discourage defectors. The strike was over, again, relatively quickly, and indeed without having to resort to violence. Machine gun companies had been brought up to surround the camp, and they were even located in the camp offices, ready to fire upon the strikers. What the strike demonstrated, though, was how quickly discipline could break down when, in particular, when men were removed from their units. And you may kind of recall the quote from Priestley right at the start of the talk. This is exactly what he's kind of talking about there. Removing individuals from their unit very quickly heightens the risk of indiscipline because of really the strength of that pull that being with the regiment has on an individual as a kind of collective group. The ringleaders of the Calais unrest were imprisoned for various terms. They were essentially very quickly demobilized as well. This despite the insistence by Haig that they should be shot. Churchill was adamant, though, that the death penalty should not be resorted to unless there was serious bloodshed. And Haig wrote in his diary that he had, quote, power by warrant to try by court-martial and shoot in accordance with the Army Act, and no telegram from the Secretary of State can affect my right to do what I think is necessary for the army. The military authorities then were clearly shaken by these events, especially because, again, and kind of thinking about that broader context a little bit, they occurred at the same time as major strikes in Belfast and on the Clyde. But Churchill remained of the opinion that this particular example in Calais had occurred essentially as a kind of hangover from the previous demobilization scheme, and before that new scheme could really, in fact, it was before it was even announced. So, certainly Churchill at this point is clear and adamant that, once the new scheme comes in, the problems go away. But smaller demonstrations do continue to take place, especially in service units and those units involved in the lines of communication. Much of the blame for these incidents was attributed to an organization known as the Herald League, which, and its political organ, the Daily Herald, sort of go back to the George Lansbury owned Daily Herald newspaper, but also the Soldiers' Union most associated with the latter, which was the Sailors, Soldiers and Airmen's Union, the SSAU. The Daily Herald remained most aloof of the establishment and continued to print articles critical of the authorities in their demobilization plans. In February, it launched a personal attack on Churchill, stating that, quote, Winston Churchill is at it again. Antwerp did not teach him his lesson, Gallipoli did not teach him his lesson, and now the great unrest in the army and the demonstrations it has caused are apparently leaving him untaught and unrepentant. Things seemed to quieten down, but indeed it was not more than seeming. Churchill did not remedy the grievances of the men, but soon saw to it that the press was muzzled. The Churchill way of curing a toothache is not to let the child's cry be heard. And the article went on to describe various examples of continued unrest, the majority again being undertaken by skilled men and individuals who were known to be trade unionists in civilian life. And the article cites then a demonstration by mechanics at Kempton Park as the largest such example. It also mentioned the soldiers' many demands, including faster demobilization, no conscription, a recognition of soldiers' committees, and a promise as well not to use soldiers for strike breaking. Finally, it asked, and what is Churchill's answer? Fixed bayonets in Whitehall, the arrest of ringleaders, threats to defer demobilization, and to stop the, quote, great privilege of leave. And the government really were quick to act upon any perceived threat, especially when it got wind of the fact that, and I say kind of, I suppose, larger scale threat. So it got wind of the fact that, military intelligence essentially understood that the Herald League, in particular, wished to attempt to get soldiers who had joined the forces as part of the Derby scheme to demobilize themselves in May 1919, which was 6 months after the end of hostilities. And there's a whole, the police raid the offices of the Herald League and also the Daily Herald. They confiscate equipment. They discover that various War Office memos had been stolen or given to them to report on. They're doing a whole a whole load of things. Rather comically, it's discovered that around about 30,000 copies of the Daily Herald are being purchased by the army for soldiers to read in France in particular, which again that's very swiftly stopped once it's discovered that it's what it's essentially doing is fomenting unrest in this way. By July then, though, of 1919, many soldiers then also feared the possibility of being sent to Russia as part of the British Army's expedition there. And again, that acts as a bit of a catalyst for unrest. And again, the Daily Herald launch a campaign, a kind of a hands-off Russia campaign, really to stop the transfer of soldiers to Russia. On kind of the other side of the coin, I think, certainly throughout the middle of 1919, there are then also many examples of a backlash towards the trade unions movements' attempts to enlist support from serving soldiers. Intelligence reports from across the country consistently point to the fact that despite their best attempts, ex-servicemen unions had no success in attracting honorary members. A man in the Royal Army Service Corps visited a camp to enlist support for the SSAU in late May, but was forced to retire as a result of the reception he had met. And even those who had already been discharged and were active members of soldiers' unions appear to have been resolute in their attitude towards the labour movement. There were less extreme organisation, members of the National Federation of Discharged and Demobilised Soldiers and Sailors and Soldiers, which had even put up candidates in the 1918 general election, rejected calls at its conference to ally itself to a socialist political body. One intelligence summary indicated, quote, it is satisfactory that the results of the conference point to the fact that ex-servicemen desire to stand alone and by a majority in every case have testified their determination to refuse to become the tools of unprincipled and professional agitators. It went on to conclude that, quote, the attitude of the soldier is improving every day, despite the attempt by agitators to cajole and flatter him to become disloyal to his sovereign and the tool of revolutionaries as represented by the Herald League. The soldier is realizing that these people are not his friends, but rather his enemies. Military intelligence were also confident about the future. In one lengthy report, it was written, the outlook is certainly growing brighter, in spite of the continual effort of the Daily Herald and the Herald League to increase the spread of their dangerous dogmas in the army. There is daily less and less interest shown in them by the servicemen. One cause is that the gradual elimination of the temporary soldier by demobilization and discharge, men who are largely imbued by unionism, tinged with socialism, and who enlisted not from liking for the life of a soldier, but from a sense of duty, naturally carried with them into the service the cult of trade unionism, and in some cases the propaganda of class warfare, and of course naturally spread their belief in the barrack room. Certainly it is encouraging to find that it is an undoubted fact that the influence of the union is a waning one. But throughout the summer, incidents did continue to take place which risked this improved state of discipline. Once again, soldiers refused to embark for overseas at Dover, and over 1,800 men mutinied at the Eastern Command Labour Centre at Sutton. The latter were also concerned that they were to be sent overseas. In both of these cases, it would seem that there was still concern that they would be sent to Russia. In August, 17 men of the 3rd West Yorkshire Regiment were sentenced by court-martial to 9 months' imprisonment with hard labour. In July, they had refused to obey an order to parade fighting equipment. They claimed that they had taken heart at an expression used by the company sergeant major in passing the order, and that now peace was declared, they considered themselves as civilians. When questioned about the incident, the sergeant major denied using certain expressions, stating that he had in fact not called them, quote, bastards, but had in actual fact said that they were a lot of Bolshevists. And this last spate of unrest prompted one newspaper editorial to declare, the recurrence of incidents that indicate the presence in the army of a good deal of unrest is much to be regretted. I think there is a tendency to exaggerate the bulk, as well as to misrepresent the character of the grievances which have led some soldiers to demonstrate in a manner not consistent with discipline. The British soldier is no Bolshevik, and now that he has every reason to believe that there is no intention to treat him other than fairly in the matters to which he has felt uneasy. So, just by way of conclusion for a few moments, and I appreciate that has been a bit of a kind of a fly through a number of different examples, a number of different incidents, but hopefully kind of builds a bit of a picture about the state, certainly the state of discipline in the army in this post-war period. In August 1919, Lloyd George complained to Churchill that demobilization has slowed down. In reply, Churchill agreed and detailed 13 or no fewer than 13 reasons why this was the case, but that it was, quote, necessary to observe that the army was in a state of general incipient mutiny in January and February, and, quote, had been restored to a condition of good discipline and contentment by following the main principle of releasing the men with the longest service before the newcomers. He concluded, quote, how foolish to suppose that the armies which took more than 4 years to spread all over the world could be brought home again by a wave of the wand. By this time, I think it was becoming clear that Bolshevism was no threat in the armed forces. Though discipline broke down, it had more to do with the perceived unjust nature of the demobilization scheme, and the fact that for some, the notions, as I've mentioned, of self-sacrifice and of patriotism no longer held relevance as a means to maintain order, despite some attempts by soldiers' unions and other organizations to mobilize support for their cause. On the 17th of October 1919, Churchill finally declared that demobilization was complete. He reported that in the 11 months since the Armistice, an average of 10,000 men had been discharged every day. It was true to say, he said, quote, that the army had melted away. As 1919 progressed, a perceived threat from the extreme left, as I've said, and fears over Bolshevism also melted away. This was despite attempts by the Herald League, the Daily Herald, and the SSAU to foment discontent. Their actions after the unrest at Folkestone and beyond in January meant that this threat had to be taken seriously, and great efforts were made to stifle their activities, including the reining in of the established press, an action which had also been so important during wartime. The perceptions of individuals in government and the unrest across Europe certainly did much to heighten concerns, while this was coupled also with an anxiety that the war had brutalized soldiers and indeed brutalized society at large. Life had become less of a worth, if you like, not worth less, but certainly not valued as highly. Ultimately, though, many soldiers had reached the end of their resilience and respect for military discipline. They had based much of their obedience on notions of patriotism and self-sacrifice, but this had terminated with the signing of the Armistice. To put it simply, the majority of men simply wanted to go home. So thank you very much. That's me done this evening. Thank you.
That was fantastic. Thank you. That's absolutely fascinating. We've got a couple of questions
Okay.
in the chat. Terence Jackson has asked, was there any difference in the attitude of soldiers from the different home nations in England, Scotland, Welsh, and Irish?
That's a really good question. I think on the whole, no, it's difficult. You know, it's certainly I've never seen any evidence that would support the idea that there were kind of obvious differences in that respect. What I would say is that because of how the strikes spread from the southeast of England in particular, you know, there are clusters of unrest, I suppose in the home counties, probably disproportionate in comparison to elsewhere. Having said that, that doesn't mean that there isn't unrest elsewhere. There's certainly unrest in Wales. There's certainly unrest in Scotland. Ireland is a little bit different because, again, because of the context of kind of you know, how and what things are looking like domestically in Ireland in late 1918 and 1919. You know, again, one of the ways certainly to look at it is in terms of you know, Welsh regiments, Irish regiments, Scottish regiments, and again, there's nothing obvious that state, you know, that would say that there's any kind of difference there that I can see. You know, there's certainly the authorities trusted certain regiments over others. Guards regiments, for example, were moved from France and Belgium back to the UK in kind of January, February, and March 1919, and the view being that it was in order to quell strikes, both from potentially from other soldiers, but also striking workers as well. So certainly the authorities naturally trust certain regiments over others in that respect. I suppose probably the most famous example of a mutiny and discontent, which kind of falls a little bit later, is the mutiny of the Connaught Rangers in India. a little bit later than this. And again, there's a really fascinating article by kind of a reassessment of that mutiny by Mario Draper, which kind of looks at, again, kind of back to this issue of officer-man relations and how the kind of dynamics of the First World War and the way in which the units served during the war had an impact, this lasting impact as well, actually, on its discipline and how this unrest and this particular mutiny kind of unfolds in in the early 1920s. So so in a long way of putting it, no, there's no kind of difference, but there's certainly, of course, some nuances there. And definitely if we look geographically across the country, unrest is happening at various severity throughout the country. And again, Andrew Rothstein's book does a fantastic job of kind of sketching that out a little bit. And again, you can really see as the unrest kind of spreads across from the southeast of England, as I say, starting in Folkestone, moving down the road to Dover and kind of going beyond that. And then spreading much beyond that as well. Really the issue, as I kind of alluded to, are with, I suppose, kind of so-called service units which, by their very nature, they have, skilled trades personnel within them. That there's an element of expertise being put into the right places by the military authorities. Naturally are individuals who are perhaps slightly more class conscious and had some kind of involvement with trade unions and the trade union movement in civilian life, and that's where a lot of the trouble is then kind of coming from as we kind of move into February and onwards in 1919.
Thank you. Andrew Boyd has asked, how did the Labour Party view demobilisation?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So, and I've kind of explored this a little bit more, kind of more broadly around kind of Labour Party attitudes to the armed forces. So, and I kind of alluded to it in the talk that there's quite a bit of resistance by serving soldiers to aligning with the Labour movement and by extension then the Labour Party. So and that's essentially comes from a kind of historic distrust of the armed forces. Historically, the Labour Party doesn't view soldiering as a savoury occupation. It doesn't support soldiers. There are various party conferences which kind of refuse to endorse any kind of connection with even soldiers' unions as well, both and that's during the war as well. So there's a real disconnect there, which certainly thinking about those trade union leaders attempting to persuade soldiers to align with their interests, if you like. There's a disconnect there, and it just doesn't happen. And that soldiers are very aware as a body of that kind of distrust, and they kind of see things very differently. I mean, as more generally in terms of demobilization, again, you get questions in Parliament, of course, around delays. You get newspaper articles in the same way from members of the Labour Party in particular, and particularly Labour MPs who again kind of take up the mantle of criticism, quite rightly, as well. And ultimately, I think certainly my belief is that decision to make the scheme first in, first out was the way out of it. I'm not always the most praiseworthy of Churchill and his decision making, but I think certainly in this case, it was an incredibly important decision to make, and kind of certainly from the I suppose the political establishment, from the opposition, etc., does take away some of that criticism which existed, because essentially once that new scheme comes in, it works. It ultimately it does work. It does what it needs to do. And again, the numbers, this idea of the army melting away, 10,000 individuals on average leaving every single day, that's fairly impressive as kind of as far as I can see it as well.
Great, thank you. Charlie Watson has asked, what was the situation in the Navy and the Air Force, and was there similar dissatisfaction there?
So yeah, again, you do. So not again. I would say it's worse in the army than it is in the Navy and the Air Force. Partly that's then in relation to scale, particularly in relation to the Air Force. But there are certainly examples of unrest of naval personnel and RAF personnel. There's quite a large demonstration, a naval demonstration, which I can't remember where that was and off the top of my head. But part of the issue, and actually it's probably less so in the Navy than anywhere else, and part of that is, you might have noticed what I spoke about here was kind of unrest, which essentially takes place either on British soil or in Calais. Ultimately, that's kind of really what we're talking about, and that's primarily because that is where the unrest takes place. If we think about the armed forces more broadly, so not just the army, being dotted about all over the world, that there just isn't unrest in the same way elsewhere, and that's partly because for the Navy, for those in the army and indeed the Air Force, away from the British Isles, the authorities can control news in a much more specific way, and so news of these demonstrations, it doesn't spread in the same way. It doesn't spiral in the same kind of way, and you just don't get it. So and that certainly explains why partly you don't see it in the same way in the Navy, but you equally don't see it in the army anywhere else really either. In those first months of 1919, it just doesn't happen in the same way, and yeah, which I think is again a really interesting kind of nuance, and also soldiers are very aware that from a disciplinary point of view, they might be treated very differently for being in the field than at home, as well. So yeah, there are those kinds of nuances as well. But yeah, again, to go back to the original question, yes, there are certainly examples. I would say not as widespread, and that's the kind of forces being spread across the world is probably one of the reasons for that as well.
Thank you. Stephen Mason has asked, was any effort made to explain to the soldiers the logic of the two initial categories of men?
Yes, a lot of effort. Yeah, absolutely. There's lots of material that's produced, lots of literature that is produced to, yeah, do exactly that. But it just doesn't do any good really for the authorities, because and you can kind of see why. Again, I kind of showed a few examples there about that kind of resentment. I think it's natural. Immediately, as I say, there's no longer fighting. And again, one thing I don't mention, of course, is that at this point it's an armistice. It's not necessarily a peace treaty in the same way. So the authorities have their own demands here that theoretically war could, or indeed military action could be required at any stage. It's certainly until the Treaty of Versailles is signed. So there are demands there, but that's not what individual soldiers are thinking. They're thinking the fighting's over. The thing I need to do now is leave, go home and get a job. And the longer I am stuck here doing, waiting for that, the more challenging it is going to be for me to find a job. So, a lot of there is literature that's produced, explainers, information, provided to soldiers. But naturally, it doesn't make a difference, because why would it make a difference to your own, to an individual circumstance, knowing that some of the people around him are being released, and are going back to a job that they might get over me. So absolutely, they're not, the authorities aren't doing this in a vacuum. It's being explained, or at least it should be being explained, and literature is being provided to individuals. But on an individual level, it just doesn't make the difference that it kind of needed to, in order to placate individuals.
Thank you. We've got just a couple of questions left. Paul Cullum asks, what were the harshest sentences handed out to mutineers, either militarily or civilian?
It's actually quite difficult to work out. So certainly, as far as I've been able to ascertain, no one was sentenced to death. The sentences tended to be, the typical was the example I gave towards the end there, which was 9 months hard labor, which then often was either reduced or commuted. And again, you look through the courts martial registers for this period, and that's quite usual. It's kind of 3, 6, or 9 months, maybe 12 to 18 months if it's a really, really severe, example. The issue, and why it's so difficult, is that a lot of these instances of unrest are being dealt with at a local level, and they don't appear in the registers. So so it's sometimes difficult. So okay, more often than not, people are being kind of let off. There are certainly examples of people just being demobilized in order to get rid of them from the army, because they're kind of troublemakers, if you like, in that sense. So the easiest solution for the military authorities is just to get them out as soon as they can. And there are definitely, anecdotally at least, examples of that. But there are any host of individual examples that I've looked at of unrest, and they just don't appear in the registers at all. And I can't see any punishments appearing in those registers. So in some cases, it can be quite challenging to work that out. But as I say, it tends to be fairly lenient. Again, officers, army officers, and indeed all levels, I think, recognize that, to some extent, the discontent is justified. They are sympathetic at least, to this point. There's a recognition that discipline should be treated in a different way, because these are citizen soldiers, they're not professional soldiers. And so, and again, you see that throughout the war as well. And certainly that continues, and perhaps, there's even added leniency that I think occurs in many cases.
Thank you. I think a final question from Gordon Holmes, who asked, were repatriated prisoners of war and wounded treated as a separate group to the other men being demobbed?
So certainly, as I understand it, with prisoners of war, yes. There were certainly, POWs took precedent in terms of their repatriation and their demobilization. In reality, that didn't always happen. I think, I've certainly looked at any number of the kind of surviving registers, and indeed the small sample of post-liberation questionnaires that exist for prisoners of war at the end of the First World War, and a lot of individuals aren't being released until late into 1919. Even this, it takes, in practice, it actually takes a long time. Theoretically, prisoners of war in particular should be released earlier. And actually one of the biggest questions, or I suppose biggest controversies, comes around the release of prisoners of war and the potential release of conscientious objectors before prisoners of war, within kind of demobilization schemes, and indeed conscientious objectors in relation to regular soldiers in general. But yeah, so in principle, yes, there are differences. Wounded soldiers, not so much. I don't think, depending on the severity of the wound, I think. But in theory, so again, there's quite a large demonstration in Shoreham, I think, which essentially is an area for soldiers recuperating. But there's a large demobilization strike essentially there in late January 1919. Because again, there's no indication that they're being treated any differently. And again, the real fear is always that, particularly if they're in Britain in January and February 1919, that they might be sent back to France and Belgium, which soldiers are just trying time and time again not to do, basically.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. William Butler, for certainly shining a light on an aspect of the First World War that I didn't have much insight into. So really, really appreciate your time, and thank you everybody else that's come along this evening to listen in. So thank you very much, and good night, everybody.
Mademoiselle from Armistice.